I'm so pleased that Vamsi Juluri has joined me once again from California. Vamsi Juluri needs no introduction. He is an old friend of mine and also one of the most prominent voices talking about India and what India needs in the global sphere, so to speak, for many, many years. Vamsi has written a very interesting article in the Indian Express, and I wanted to discuss that with him. He talks about the failure of Indian narrative, and this word narrative has really echoed across India, especially after the Pahalgam attack and Operation Sindoor. That India is really failing to get its narrative act together. Now, Vamsi is someone who's been talking about this for at the very least a decade, perhaps even earlier. But I know of him talking about it for about a decade. And the time has come once again where a lot of people are really concerned about why India, now the fourth largest economy in the world, just cannot get its narrative right around the world. Vamsi, welcome.
Thank you, Hindol. It's a pleasure to be back talking with you. Although our last conversation a couple of months ago was also about a disaster that was the environmental disaster of the California fires. And now we have the cultural and humanitarian disaster of a horrible terrorist attack and a war, a mini war, and the problem which concerns us here today, which I wrote in my op-ed, which is the absolute lack of understanding of what is going on in the popular mind, especially here in the West.
So, Vamsi, let me begin with a very sort of basic question, but also I think the most important and urgent question. Why is the Indian narrative, for a long time, Vamsi, we believed that we were probably too poor, probably we didn't have the right sort of inroads into the West, we were too, Anglo-centric. All of this has changed considerably. And, dare I say, you and I have been part of that change in the last decade. And yet in 2025, we come to another point once again where we are forced to face the fact that in the West, the Indian narrative just is not taking hold. What's going wrong, Vamsi?
I'll start with a quote from a book I read when I was doing my PhD Hindol. It's a book called Vidya Vahini, and it's talks given by our family guru Sri Satya Sai Baba on education, what makes a good educator, and things like that. And he coined a very interesting phrase in there. There's a very popular saying, Yatha Raja Tatha Praja. And that may be true. But he says, well, it's translated in English. And there is a saying, it's Yatha Acharya or Yatha teacher, Tatha Praja. So I want to focus on the fact that I'm approaching this from the point of view of a teacher, a media studies, journalism, film, communications teacher, who's been interacting with a very specific demographic, you could say, 18 to 22 or 24-year-old students, year after year, semester after semester, week after week, now for about 25 years. So I have seen essentially two complete generational cohorts come and enter college. When I started teaching late 90s, early 2000s, I was kind of like a slightly older brother to my students. I mean, I'm like you, I guess, Gen X, as they say here. And my students were millennials. And years passed, and then a whole different generational cohort started coming in. And now we have a generation which, by all accounts, has been severely fractured from its sense of the past in many ways, thanks to this very intrusive new technology, which is the smartphone, and various other factors going on. But I want to highlight the fact that what in India we consider the Indian narrative, with many people sort of speaking about it, is largely a spectacle that is being made by and for and within Indian audiences. So, you have people on television screens and doing all this. But what I see here year after year is, the conversations that take place within, a group of people who are going to be the media in the future, right? Many of my students will go and work in the media. They're going to be in the news. They're going to make documentaries, human rights work, films. They're very much into the storytelling business, the storytelling arts. And I get to interact with them on the India narratives, as we might call it. I get to screen for them, the movies from India. I get to share clips of news from India, as well as of what other things that are going on around the world. And I can tell you that two or three things are very evident to me. There is a very big gap between what Indian elites, particularly officials and business leaders, think is going on with the Indian perception in the West, and what I see every day, particularly in this smaller but very influential group of people who are going to be the future of storytelling about India in the West, and to Indian audiences too. So, I think two, three key points I want to tell you from what I have seen in the last 25 years. Um, I'll start with a very vivid example. In 1997 or 98, I was teaching a class called Writing for Communication, and that was one of the first classes I ever taught as a TA. And for some reason, an opportunity came up to share my ongoing research, which was on MTV and music videos in India at the time. So I played a Tollywood song, some Telugu hit song, uh, and when I did that, the first thing that happened was the whole class gasped. Okay, they just went like that, and it was one of those carts you wheel in to the classroom and you put on a VHS tape. And it was, I don't even remember what the song was. It was a very typical Bollywood, Tollywood kind of song. There's a hill station and hero and heroine, and the heroine, is dancing and the hero pulls a sari or something. And everyone gasped because they thought it was extremely, extremely rude and, sexist to do for the hero to have done that to the heroine. Now, in India, we consume all of this and it goes on and on. We don't think twice about it. So, from that time to the present, I can tell you what has changed, what has not changed. And one of the most pertinent things to our conversation today, frankly, about the Indian narrative is that uh, there is a sense deeply ingrained, deeply also instigated, installed, incepted, if you will, by very powerful lobbies and propaganda agencies and vested interests and so on, which we have not been able to study, fight, and resist, in any organized or sustained or well-funded way ourselves. There is this influence building. There is this story that has been put into American minds in the last 20, 25 years. And I'll work down the ladder with two or three words. I think the biggest word, frankly, I'll go one step more global than the India narrative, and that is the narrative about terrorism. I have to share, and this may be a bit of a surprise to, I think, many of the people in India who are following, the visits of the delegations, which by all means have been very, well organized and successful and everything. Wonderful speeches from Dr. Sashi Tarur and all the other delegates. That's all wonderful. But I think it's very important to recognize that for a lot of people under 30 in America today, the word terrorism doesn't terrify them. Okay. The word terrorism doesn't come across the way it does to many people in India who've been victims of terrorism, and or in Israel for that matter, or in Europe for that matter. Uh, this idea that a human life can be just taken and snuffed out by somebody. People have been taught and re-educated very, very actively in the last couple of decades in colleges and maybe in schools and popular culture to essentially celebrate certain kinds of acts of violence based on a very false narrative about oppression and oppressiveness and colonizers and colonizee or colonials. So, um, you know, when the Pahalgam attack happened and the way it was, covered in the U.S., most of the reports were kind of following the usual playbook. They were saying things like, India, Pakistan, nuclear powers about to get into conflict. Then these gunmen came, and here's a key phrase: many of the reports started talking about indiscriminate firing, and we know that in India, it was. I mean, all the video recordings of the survivors started coming back. People were talking about how they were religiously profiled, their pants were pulled down and checked. All these things happened. And those things somehow were not allowed to permeate into the American mind. So I think the biggest problem here is you can see that the media bias, the bias in education here, has essentially done two things. One, it has kept the India narrative or the story of India where it has, for a very long time, just made some tweaks here and there. But the bigger problem is, even in the early 2000s, I started teaching here in San Francisco in September 2001. And I was given a class to teach called Media Stereotyping and Violence because I was a new kid and no one else wanted to teach it. They gave it to me. I said, sure, I'll teach it. And 2 weeks after that, the 9/11 attacks happened. And, that's when I got an interest in learning more about terrorism and war and all the role of media. And those years, students appreciated learning about the complexities of geopolitics, imperialism, jihadism, all these things.
But this is exactly, I'm like so glad you mentioned 9/11, Vamsi, because I wanted to come to that. So, what is the problem, Vamsi? One problem, of course, is that perhaps a whole new generation of young Americans are already so far away from 9/11 that they are once again in a world where America is eternally safe. And they have in a sense never, this is a generation that perhaps does not feel the memories of 9/11 so strongly anymore. That's one. And the second equally scary thing for me is the reporters who are reporting the Pahalgam incident obviously know, the American newspapers or the American television channels, they know what happened. They know that these people were religiously profiled. They know that, the trousers of men were pulled down and they were checked for their religion and they were specifically killed because of their religion. And yet they're choosing as an active act of choice. This is not an act of that they didn't know and therefore they couldn't report it. This is an act of choice. They're choosing not to present these facts before their audience. That's actually far more dangerous. And Vamsi, it's not clear to me how we will be able to change that by presenting greater information, because they're obviously selecting this and shafting through the information and choosing what they want to present and leaving everything aside. Even if we put a voluminous amount of information in front of them, they will still choose what they want.
That's a very pertinent question, Hindol, and it seems to me that in a way, my guru's admonition, Yatha Acharya, in this case, Yatha Journalism Acharya or reporting professor or media professor, senior editors, Tata journalists and reporters. So what has happened essentially is that, sorry, Hindol, I'm again getting a lot of noise. It stopped briefly. I'll be able to, yeah. Are you still able to hear me? Oh, now I can't hear you. Okay, but that's, shall I go on? Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. So, it's not surprising at all. And this is why, again, what you just mentioned, the fact that now for nearly 10 or 20 years, you have reporters and writers and editors and TV anchors who are already deeply primed into shutting out any facts that inconvenience their deeply invested assumption of what the story is, what is going on here. So there is a huge change in the nature of journalism itself at the ground level. I mean, at the top level, you definitely, there has been increasing media monopolization in the last 10 or 20 years. There was that important article that appeared in the Free Press a couple of weeks ago, saying how Qatar bought America. And in that article, which I referred in my Indian Express piece, there are two things to remember. One is, of course, they put billions of dollars into broadcasting like Al Jazeera, as well as investing even in emerging conservative platforms in the US, billions of dollars into higher education. But they have also taken care of the micro social, micro cultural, micro interactions. They have been very clear about their own story about themselves, whether it comes from, I think a broader belief in Islamic glory and revival, as you discussed with our friend Venkat Dulipala a few days ago in the case of Pakistan. Um, and or something else. But that story that in the Middle East, in Islam, is a global alternative to the failed, corrupt capitalist West, is being advanced with great sophistication in an idiom that the American youth can understand and relate to. And that is, I think, what's been happening the last 10 or 20 years very, very quickly. And that is what we have not been able to do. At best, we are able to say, hey, our economy is growing, our democracy is growing, we've lifted people out of poverty. We're reeling off government achievements, here and there. But these people are constructing amazing stories like Slumdog Millionaire, for example. I think that movie was iconic in bringing together a deeply felt emotional experience about the underdog triumphing against the odds, against the caste system, against rich corrupt Hindus like movie stars and TV show hosts, and then what they'll read in the classrooms, um, and what they believe is good journalism. And so one more example that comes to mind is this book called, I think, Bad News by Batya Ungar Sargon, who's the editor at Newsweek and a self-described MAGA leftist or a so I mean, she has some interesting views because she's advancing, I think, what used to be taught by far left Marxist professors in cultural studies in the 90s, which is attention to poverty and working class and things like that. And anyway, in that book, Bachunga Sagran talks about, in a way, the gentrification of journalism as a profession, starting in the early 2000s or so. It's what she says is, because journalism, education, liberal arts degrees are so expensive in the US, and journalism pays so less, there's a sort of a filtration going on where it's mostly children from slightly more privileged families who go into these professions. And then once they go in there, they're kind of in this bubble, what they hear in high school, what they hear in colleges, what they hear from their parents or NPR and New York Times. They're in the self-selected bubble. And inside that bubble, um, in a way, they have come to a very, very clear and firm understanding of the world in terms of good guys and bad guys, the oppressors and oppressees, and many of them grew up, I think, in the early 2000s, or at least their parents became parents at a time when the biggest problem we confronted in America, I guess, from 2003 onwards, almost for a decade, was the fact that a horrible terrorist event happened, 9/11, and people were still talking about it as a horrible terrorist event at that time. Um, but then people were also disappointed by the way the politicians led America into a war against a country that wasn't involved with 9/11, and a lot of people died and, all that horrible stuff happened. So I think, that anti-war sentiment, the concerns about economic inequality, the Wall Street greed, all those things, combined with, education in a sense, sort of being captured by um, uh, both, not just economic forces, but also by a very compelling narrative that global capitalism had failed. Look at Slumdog Millionaire, look at capitalism in India, for example, where there's a lot of wealth being created now, but it's mostly for the Hindus. That's the way they see it, mostly for the upper caste. And Muslims in India or in Pakistan or elsewhere are kind of being oppressed by this American white supremacist, Zionist, Hindutva, Brahminical capitalist machine. And naturally, they're taking up arms. So you can't call it terrorism. So I think, a very compelling narrative has uh, taken root in America. And that's what you're seeing with journalists. And the meaning of journalism has changed because the journalism, education, media studies, education, media literacy training, I've started to look at this very carefully because in the last 10, 15 years, there's a lot of money being put into media literacy training and detecting fake news and things like that. And I can tell you off the bat, media, a lot of these training programs don't ask the big questions like who owns the media, Is it who's funding this particular story or news report you're seeing? And all they do is they kind of train you to um, essentially get your beliefs confirmed. So I think it's the nature of how the medium itself, the phone, social media, how it feeds ego. It reduces an opportunity to learn. And then journalists, you have very openly saying things like, um, um, censorship is good, or we don't have to show all sides of the story. Like they believe that the other side of the story is so evil, and to use the word they use now, is so harmful, that it needs to be excluded. So right now, that's the way I think they think, that it would be quote unquote harmful to minorities and oppressed groups to report that there was religious profiling in Pahalgam. It's deep, deep condition.
But this is very, very tricky then, Vamsi. This is very tricky because, of course, we see manifestations of this in many ways. I mean, we see manifestations of this in, for instance, the very easy, simplistic coupling of Gaza with Kashmir, which has been tried again and again, and it's been going on for a long time. For some time, the same kind of, boycott, divest movement that was tried against Israel was tried against India. Of course, India is too big for it to really work in the same way. But this is happening again and again. And even though India has very good ties with all the Gulf states, including with Qatar, a lot of this kind of funding actually, once it translates down or once it filters down to the recipients do what they want with that money. And in a sense, actually, as far as Qatar is concerned, I mean, in the larger program, even if India gets a bad reputation, what do they care? So, in a sense, this is very. I mean, this is very problematic, and it's not very clear. I mean, it's almost like as India succeeds more and more, this entire thing will only get worse because as we get richer and richer, in a sense, we will be called more and more oppressive. The fun thing, Vamsi, is, and the dark thing in this is that the Chinese don't seem to be, affected by this. No one is saying China is this terrible oppressive power, it oppresses so many people, it's a one-party state, it won't even let, American media into the country, it oppresses people in Xinjiang. All of this seems to be absent in the Western narrative.
Yeah, this is again a very peculiar split. You can see, right, that India has good human relations, business relations, perhaps geostrategic relations with so many countries. In fact, this clip of Dr. Shashi Tharoor from a few years ago saying that he's been humbled because India seems to be the only country whose prime minister can hug, the leader of both Ukraine and Russia. I think there is that kind of personal warmth at the leader level, and maybe at the human level. A lot of people manage to somehow strike personal connections abroad, whether it's in business or in communication or teaching. But I think there is a psychological cost, there is a moral cost, and ultimately there is going to be a catastrophic cost to the planet, not just to Indians. And so the effect of this kind of divestment campaign, which some accounts say was implemented in full force in that United Nations conference on racism in South Africa about 25 years ago, where they decided that now that apartheid in South Africa had been successfully ended, it was time for all the well-meaning people of the world to unite and fight quote unquote Zionism in Israel and, quote unquote Brahmanism or the caste system or Hindutva or whatever in India. So, the economic impact of divestment on India probably hasn't happened just yet. I mean, I think many Hindu students in campuses were slightly worried after Pahalgam because this is the new normal now. That as the moment there is a catastrophic terrorist attack by Islamists against non-Muslims, as and the way it took place in Pahalgam, there is a concern now that in the new normal is for people to rush out on campuses and the streets and say, stop oppressing us to Hindus or Jews or whoever. So there was a little bit of concern, and there was, I think, a mild attempt made to push that because in campuses like Berkeley, I believe and certain other campuses, you had, South Asian student groups, activist groups. Well, Harvard actually hosted a Pakistan conference, the Lakshmi Mittal funded institute or whatever, South Asia Institute. They actually, hosted that, and all they did was, I believe, they took the name of the website or something, because at least some of the Hindu students, raised their voices and, used the dreaded H word, Hindu phobia. In another campus here, not in my university, I was told by a student, I think it's public now. Apparently, just after the Pahalgam massacre, this discussion came up in a classroom, and the professor told a Hindu student in the class, well, it's your people's fault. So there is this narrative in a lot of people's minds that even if Pahalgam takes place and even if Muslims profile non-Muslims and do something like this, it's the Hindus' fault, because people assume that what they've been reading, the headlines in New York Times or Washington Post or BBC or Al Jazeera English for the last 25 years, where they all the time see Hindu nationalists and they see photos of these angry guys with trishuls. They believe that's, every time they see that photo, they think that, like, oh my God, this Hindu has gone and killed 10 Muslims or something. That's how the mind works. So there is that conditioning that has happened, that this is understandable resistance or backlash to something 10 times worse Hindus have been doing the last 25 years. So the story has been built. What is the outcome? Where is it headed? Well, at the moment, there isn't, as far as I know, a sustained divestment campaign against in India the way it took place with Israel. But I think what we're seeing, and we have to start bracing for, if we really want to change this, given the limited resources we have, is and the peculiarities of our own historic experience as a polytheistic, polynarrative society, which holds together somehow in spite of having many gods, or perhaps because of having many gods and deities and traditions and punyakshetras and things like that, as opposed to the monotheisms and the monotheism, which is like sort of ganging up. I think the divestment, and I'd like everyone to, I'd like us to really think about it, is there's a kind of a psychological divestment that's going on. There is a very infamous statement which was coined in relation to the Native American boarding schools, right? Starting the 1890s till about the 1970s. I mean, even after the civil rights movement and they gave voting rights to African Americans and all that, imagine, there was this horrible thing, slow genocide going on in North America of indigenous children, being sent to these boarding schools where they were essentially given concentration camp state treatment. They were made to cut off their hair. They were punished for speaking their native language or praying to their native gods, and horrible things were done to them. That phrase, which I want us to think of in relation to the psychological divestment impact of all this stuff going on today, was "kill the Indians, save the man." Okay. So it was coined by this guy called Colonel Richard Pratt, who was a military prison warden, okay, who had gained a notorious reputation for torturing Native Americans, prisoners of war, and breaking their spirit. He was put in charge of their children. So I want us to think of that concept of killing the Indian, saving the man today, because I think what's happened now with the last 20, 30 years is psychological model has been put in place where individually Indians can come, collectively India can continue to have good ties with Qatar or America or all these countries, do business. But psychologically, everybody is being sort of told by the culture at large, by the stories permeating everywhere about us, that you have to check the reality of who you are and what is happening to you more and more. So it's like we're in a gaslighting chamber. And there's a very interesting book. I mean, these are the kind of books I end up reading when I talk about narratives. Inside Story, How Narratives Drive Mass Harm. And, there is interestingly, when I open it, it comes to the page about the 1830 Native American removals. So scholars in psychology, neuroscience, and education, media studies, literary theory, literature, art history, they're all studying narratives in a very, very rigorous, systematic fashion in the West. And of course, we tend to just use the word narrative more loosely. So I think there is massive harm, to use a contemporary word, being done by the kind of reporting where they conceal the fact that religious profiling happens.
No, this occurred to me, Vamsi, recently when I saw these two Israeli diplomats who had just come out of an ACJ function in Washington D.C. and they were just brutally murdered by this guy who shouted "Free, free Palestine" or something like that, and these two people, as darkly ironic as it may seem, turned out that these two people were great proponents of peace between Palestinians and Israelis, great proponents of how to build those bridges to bring peace and so on and so forth, and yet they had been killed only because they were Israeli. Now, something like this has already been tried on Indian diplomats. If you remember, I'm seeing Canada, when those billboards would go up with the names and photographs of our diplomats, offering to pay a bounty for their addresses, the days, and we should be really careful about this, the day is not far off when something like this could actually happen to an Indian diplomat. Somebody will build a tale of a narrative of hatred and oppression, and somebody will therefore feel in some foreign capital will feel it's absolutely valid to kill an Indian tourist or to kill an Indian diplomat.
My campus happens to be like just a couple of blocks away from the old Indian embassy, Indian consulate here in San Francisco. And they've moved because, that consulate, I think, was the target of an arson attack. And several temples, Hindu temples in the Bay Area and across the US have also been targets of hate graffiti. And unfortunately, again, the narrative in play in many campuses among the young is that, the Hindutva government in India is repressing religious minorities in India. So they're just, protesting. And of course, people don't stop and ask, okay, you can do a protest outside a consulate, hold up signs, but why are you burning it down? Why are you calling for the death of diplomats like in Canada? Why are you attacking Hindu temples, right? When you claim that this is not about religious hate or it's not about Hindu phobia, all of these things are happening. So I wanted to actually draw the attention of our viewers today to a wonderful series of articles that are appearing in First Post, written by Sriram Chellapilla, a dear friend of mine from Hyderabad and a former student of mass communication. So Sriram has been analyzing the narratives both from Canada and in the US about this whole issue extremely carefully. And I think one of the recent pieces he wrote is about the US court judgment, which alleges that Indian intelligence agents were involved with plotting a murder here in the US. And I don't know if anybody has actually looked through that particular judgment and what they're saying. And so Sriram approaches it from a storytelling perspective. Okay, this is a book about storytelling. As a screenwriter, like if you're teaching your students to write a script about a murder mystery, how do you make it plausible? So he's doing some very interesting interdisciplinary work. So again, it's the power of story. So the story is full of holes, and there are people like Sriram who are exposing it, which is good. But in the mass mind, we are in a dangerous situation, as you said, because, to go back to the example you mentioned of that poor couple, I think, who are soon going to get married, even though the assassin was very, very brazen about the reasons he was doing it, just as, the Pahalgam terrorists were, in NPR and, various newspapers, New York Times, etc., the headlines would say things like, that investigators are looking for motives. The way they're just conditioned to immediately obfuscate these things. So I think we are in a fairly precarious situation where people are being conditioned to say, oh, it's okay to get killed, but it's not okay to complain because that would be racist.
I have two last questions for you, Vamsi. My first question is that anybody who studied this, and I'm going to write a long essay about this, but I want to put this to you because you've lived in America for all these years. You saw 9/11, you've seen the aftermath and all of that. It seems to me that global jihad, as we understood it, has, in a sense, taken a different turn. Till about 2015-16, Vamsi, it was all about relentless attacks on Western cities and other cities also, but especially Western cities, via these cars which would ram through crowds, by these sort of, people who would knife through crowds, bomb attacks, and so on and so forth. But in a sense, it seems to me that this whole gang of institutions, perhaps led by the Muslim Brotherhood as the intellectual fulcrum, has decided that in some senses the demographics are now good enough to attempt a sort of institutional capture and narrative capture. And therefore, whether it's the rise of the so-called Muslim vote in the UK, whether it's the rise of greater money being available via countries like Qatar into all kinds of narrative pushes, which have direct repercussions on perhaps certain kinds of elections, certainly local elections, if not national ones. There is an institutional capture shift of mindset that has happened. And that makes it, in a sense, worse for a country like India. Because today it's not just about the terror attack, it's about actually taking over institutions and using them against the so-called enemy, the oppressors, so to speak.
I think, the Free Press article about Qatar's capture, well, actually, it's not the first time. There was a book called The Arab Lobby a few years ago, which looked at how, Saudi funding, through PR agencies, through universities, and even through school curriculum materials, which the, embassies would put out to schools all the way from the 70s and 80s onwards. All of these have essentially work their way into America. And again, see, the capture is not just through influence or money or through demographics and things like that. It is through storytelling. So if we really, I know modern Indians like to think we're the original, we are the OG liberals, the OG mother of democracy and all that. So I think we need to step up to the plate and say, look, okay, fine, you guys have democratically captured the sympathy of millions of Americans. And if we call you useful idiots and left liberals and wokes and things like that, we are not winning any hearts and minds or changing them, much less. So how do each one of us who can, has a bit of technology, a bit of an ability to speak, who has a tongue and typing fingers today, how do we understand the situation? We are the little guys, like we are Robin Hood and they're the sheriff. We are Rama in exile, they are Ravan. I mean, the odds are very much against us. We are the real global underdogs in so many ways, notwithstanding the fact that some of us may be economically middle class or upper middle class. In the narrative battle, in the influence battle, we are the underdogs. I think we have to be absolutely clear about that self-perception. And one way to move forward, I would say, is really to go back to this idea of yatha acharya tata praja. Each one of us, I think, has to restore our learning curve, our learning button. And for that, I would say, the first thing we need to do is just know that we don't know. And I think the big problem with how Qatar or all these foundations and lobbies have managed to win American minds is they have been very precise in understanding and learning from the American mind. And I think they were very smart because if you compare it, in the 90s or early 2000s, you had two immigrant communities, let's say for convenience sake, Hindus and Muslims, or particularly Arab Muslims and so on. One community decided to work hard, keep its head down, not get into trouble, create jobs, do all that stuff, and then keep kind of saying, oh, but we've done very well. We don't break the law. We're not in prisons. We pay taxes. And we are the model minority. That's Hindus. And in the other community, well, for the most part, obviously, most people are law-abiding and all that is commendable. And I've had wonderful students from all communities in my colleges. So we hope, the spirit of the university as a diverse place where everyone can respectfully learn from each other is restored. But at the lobbying level, what they've done is very, very clever. And this has been analyzed, right, particularly after the October 7th Hamas attacks. They essentially aimed for this position of the underdog. So earlier, Americans always had this kind of sympathy for, African Americans and what was done to them and Native Americans and so on. And all that, remorse, all that guilt has essentially been appropriated or colonized for, certain, causes, whether it's Palestine or Kashmir and so on.
And that's why I want to ask the last question, Vamsi, before you go into. My last question is, in all of this, what are the Chinese doing right that we can learn from? That's number one. That's one part of the question. And the second part, of course, is what can we holistically do? End to end, what can we do?
See, one of the questions a lot of people ask me on Twitter in response to this or some of my other, posts about this narrative battles and propaganda and all these things, is that, look, China doesn't care about narratives. You don't see them complaining on social media that, hey, you're saying wrong things about us. And, you know, I think that it's a very, very different game, because we are more vulnerable, I think, to these external narratives and psyops for the simple reason that we are speaking in English, and most Indian elites are English oriented. So unless we are deeply critical and rooted, both rooted in our memories of our ancestors and ourselves, and in the growing literature on the West, the Westology, whether it's S.N. Bal Gangadhar or, his school, or Sitaram Goel, understanding where they're coming from, how it's impacting us. Most Anglophone Indians are by nature more culturally, psychologically, linguistically, I think, exposed. That is one part of it. But the other part, which is more hard-nosed, brass tacks, as they say. So I can tell you in the early 2000s, we had a huge increase in students coming in to study all over the Bay Area, from China. And, very hardworking, but also very, very, kind of I think, Chinese equivalent of the Indian liberalization 90s MTV generation, very stylish, savvy, well off, all these things. Until that happened, every campus in America would very often see a bunch of, liberal white people, professors, students, and a few Tibetans walking around saying, "Free Tibet," very peacefully. That completely vanished. Okay. Now you don't see anyone talking about Tibet in American universities. In the 90s, when I was in college, Tibet, South Africa, were the big issues. Now there is no discussion of Tibet in any campuses that I know of. That is one. Now, as far as the what they are doing, I think it's naive to think that they just don't care and they sit in their ivory tower and through just business, they have managed to bend everybody to their will or their interests. I'll give you a small trivial example. In the years that there were a lot of students from there coming to campuses here, every building would every day or every week, whenever it was, see copies of this Chinese newspaper placed in the campuses, in the cafeteria, etc. Because it was just expected that, the Chinese consulate had the funds, they had the training, they had the outreach, the will, the infrastructure to make sure that students from China were getting their version of the story. Okay. Now people talk about the fact that, we are a democracy, they're not, and so on. All that is a different debate. But all I'm saying is there was an active information policy and perhaps an active disinformation inoculation policy, call it what you will. But they took the trouble, the consulates, they took the trouble to have consulates and think tanks or whatever, keep their populations abroad, the diaspora abroad, informed. Now, by contrast, again, I don't want to criticize members of our diplomatic staff because they do so much for us. Anytime there's a crisis, a poor Indian student is killed or somebody has an emergency, they go out of their way to help. And, the way they're being harassed by some of these, militant lobbyists here is very, very bad. So with all sympathy, I will respectfully tell them that the fact that our foreign service cadre, understaffed, overworked, whatever it is, has also failed to understand that you have to get into the storytelling business. Like in 2016, when that whole California textbook spat took place, right, when they were going to change India and put South Asia and bring in this whole paradigm. And you and I had a great conversation on the stage in Delhi, I think, at that time. You remember at that time, when some of the consulates, ambassadors for the other countries were coming and speaking, and they were just saying, look, children of our immigrants are being affected by this bad stuff or incorrect stuff. But our policy was those are internal matters of the US. We shouldn't say anything. So now, and I jokingly, said to people, in that case, you should at least ask if an activist or somebody applies for a visa to India, at least ask them, okay, did you support this idea that there's no India, only South Asia? Then go to the South Asia embassy. Why come to India embassy? Don't deny them, don't harass them, but at least jokingly educate them. So speaking of education and what has to be done, so this is just a table. This is on academia.edu, and I want to expand this. This is a list of all the tropes that you continue to see with increasing pervasiveness and intrusiveness in American narratives about India. It's a tropes of Hinduphobia, basically. And I've just laid it all out. It could be a slur like cow piss drinker, which the terrorists used at Pulwama, or an NPR radio producer used. It could be small things, which affect all communities, like bias, the use of labels in headlines. I think it's very important for all of us to realize, particularly parents abroad, to simply start thinking about the fact that perhaps they are not really getting through to their children even. I mean, they take the children to these Bal Vihar, Bal Vikas classes on Sundays, and recently we were in a parents, planning meeting for next year, and when I talked about my Hinduphobia article and Pulwama and Pahalgam, I could see the reaction it had on some people. Some people froze. They were like this. It was making them uncomfortable. And I think the core issue right now, we should at least recognize the core issue. We are living in a state of mass fear. So we pretend it's not there when we gather on the weekend, or when our diplomats come, or our leaders go on their tours. We feel good about it, and we're also building temples, all of that. But the core issue is we are the victims of mass fear, mass dehumanization, and we better get our acts together. Um, and the way I would suggest, the core idea I want to end with is media education, because that's what I'm good at. I can't talk about politics and war and all this stuff. As a media educator doing this for 25 years, speaking with 18 to 25-year-olds, 16 to 25-year-olds, that age group. I mean, I also speak to some of the school kids at Bal Vihar sometimes. And I can tell you that what we need to restore if we want to make Bharat again, or Sanatana Dharma survive one more generation, we have to get back into the Yatha Acharya Tata Sishya Tata Praja. Tata Loka. The whole world needs us to really connect with the children who are going to be growing up in the next 20, 30 years. That's the future.
Very well said, Vamsi. Thank you very much for this detailed conversation looking at various aspects of why India is losing the narrative war. There's one thing that we never touched upon, Vamsi, and I wonder, but you did begin by saying this. Do you think that Pakistan winning the narrative war is because it is framed as being oppressed by a larger India?
Absolutely. In fact, the one keyword I just realized I missed pertains to that. It's the word beggar. This word beggar has become such a common slur in Indian social media for Pakistan and for minorities. And unfortunately, see, we don't realize that some words, some insults could be okay within a muhalla context. I'm not saying that word is so elitist. I'm not saying it's okay at all, ever. But what has happened is, because of this economic argumentation, these elitist slurs, every other word that Hindus or Indians say today on social media becomes a noose around our own necks. Because we've forgotten our traditional Hindu values of humility, traditional Hindu values of respecting everybody, regardless of whether they're rich or poor. Until the 90s, sociologists say we had this culture called conspicuous frugality. Post 90s, with economic liberalization, consumerism, media advertising, we just started thinking it's okay to flaunt our wealth. And unfortunately, now it's reached a point where, we come across as very, very crass and elitist when we say such things. And look at the case of Qatar. Until the 70s and 80s, there were two stereotypes of Arabs in the American media, well documented, studied in hundreds of papers and conferences. One was the terrorist, the Palestinian terrorist. The other was the wealthy Arab sheikh. And they have completely transformed that image. And now, the dominant image of, I think, the Indian in America is not poverty. It's not the snake charmer, as Honorable Minister Nirmala Sitharaman ji said in Stanford, the day before that horrible attack took place. She said there's a problem with the West mind picture of India. There is, and but it's not no longer poverty. It's the opposite. What they're seeing is Anil Kapoor's face as a obnoxious quizmaster from Slumdog Millionaire. They are seeing those images from Monkey Man and all these movies where it is India being rich. Uh, that is the image that is set in, and Pakistan being poor, Muslims being oppressed. So I think that is the core issue here, that the sympathy is going to remain as long as we don't rein in our elitism.
It's very well put, Vamsi. Thanks very much. Very detailed conversation, as always, very insightful on many of the things that you study at a regular basis. Of course, so many of us, notice these things, but of course, you have a far deeper, richer understanding. Not only do you, study this, you also teach it. So therefore, you have a far richer understanding. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for explaining these issues at a time when a lot of people in India and around the world are asking, why is India losing the narrative battle? And, you've given very structured recommendations on what we can do about it. I thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Hindol. Pleasure.